Revolution, and this is the audio-only podcast of our episode with the Derrick Varn, host of Zero Books Theorizing with the Hammer, co-host of Pop the Left, where Derick argues with our Zero Books boss, if you will, Doug Lane, host of his own show, The Varn Vlog, that Pascal and I were on recently. So we had talked about going on Varn's show and then Varn coming on our show. And we were like, well, what do you want to talk about? And I didn't know if he wanted to have some sort of like theory discussion. And no, you know what he wanted to talk about? He wanted to talk about drug war and how the drug war influences immigration policy and got someone like AMLO in office. And the issues with a neoliberal like AMLO. So it was a very interesting show, but the first thing we had to do was kind of talk about the drug war and Mexico's place in it. Because when we talk about cocaine cartels, what's the first name that comes to mind? Seriously, be honest. If I had said to you right now, cocaine wars, cocaine cowboys, cartel, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Probably Pablo Escobar, Colombia, Medellin, the 80s, Miami Vice, drug-influenced bad decisions on TV shows like Alf. I'm totally kidding. I watched the shit out of Alf. But I'm not going to sit here and lie and act like that was not a drug-induced idea. I saw Permanent Midnight with Ben Stiller. All jokes aside, we took a deep dive into cartel history that, I don't want to say unfortunately, it just took up a lot of the first half of the show. And if you want to hear the second half, there's only one way. Become a patron. It's easy. Patreon.com/Bitter Lake Presents. It's just that simple. It's a very good second half. We went about another hour and a half or so. Staying on topic. Derick has a very, very, very deep knowledge and a personal attachment because he has worked with people that are refugees, if you will, of this drug war. We talked about the history of the Colombian cartels and how they went down in the 90s, and that, empowers the Mexican cartels, NAFTA's effect on the growth of the Mexican cartels. This was a fun episode. I shouldn't say fun. When I say fun, these talks are in-depth and illuminating. And these episodes that you're getting, the previous audio only was that literally a couple days before this, when we did it initially with Josiah and Keith, which was, Pascal and I are still talking about that episode. And I'm actually contemplating putting the bonus, maybe some clips from the bonus patron only into that episode, which the conversation just got deeper. And that's how this episode was too. The conversation just got deeper. I made a video that I'm rather proud of as an intro video for this before Derick comes in. If you want to see these intro videos opposed to just hearing them, if you want to be a part of these shows, There's one way to do it. It's simple. YouTube.com/This Is Revolution Podcast. Subscribe. It's free. Costs you fucking nothing to click the bell. The audience is growing. The chat is getting more fun. And we've built a pretty nice community in the chat, I would say. So that's why I enjoyed those live streams. And that's why we've been doing special live streams for patrons only. We just did a nerd show, a 3-hour nerd show for patrons only. Myself, Conan Neutron, Jean Bajlan, Matthew Film Guy that you may know from the Majority Report. 3 hours. We talked a lot of shit. Definitely talked about comic book movies, why DC can't get right, cartoons of the 80s. Shout out to the homie Dan Larson at Toy Galaxy. If you are around my age, maybe even a little younger, I'll be 44 this year. I'm a victim of capitalist realism. There's definitely a lot of 80s cartoons and toys I was a fan of. Dan Larson at Toy Galaxy does a great show, revisiting those days of yore, but also giving you a really good, I don't want to say critique, but context on why a lot of things happen the way they happen or went under. And Dan's been on this show a couple times, once when it was just an audio-only podcast, and I really asked him a lot of questions about that because I felt like these were leftist critiques more so than a show like The Toys That Made Us. So, enough about that. Now let's get back on track. No rhyme. This is our show with C. Derrick Varn, where we discuss the drug wars, empire, enjoy, and I am out. What up? Happy Thursday, everybody. Foreign Policy Thursday. It's a good one today because we're talking to a comrade. Before I bring him in, let me bring in my comrade. He's also my co-host. He's also the baddest motherfucker in South Florida. You know him as Pascal Robert. I know him as Pascal motherfucking Robert. Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat, peace and greetings to the audience. Jason Miles, my brother, how you living? What is good? What is good?
I'm all right, man. I'm all right. I'm ready for this show. I had to go down a bit of a research rabbit hole, reading a lot. I didn't know what angle we were going to take on this. We had spoken briefly via Messenger with Derick about what he wanted to talk about and how he wanted to talk about it. So I think hopefully I didn't annoy him too much by asking him little questions about how to approach this episode. But it is one that is actually somewhat dear to me because I did spend a good amount of time touring in places like Juarez right after it had become it was still kind of dangerous, but it wasn't what it was. right? When I was there was no heads on stakes, but there was definitely finding, mass graves and shit like that. So it was still very dangerous, but it has become a place that I love. And I made an intro video. So before we bring in our guest today, let's check out this video about what we're going to talk about today.
Right and left keep blaming each other for the current increase. Immigration has unfortunately been politicized to the point that having a real discussion about what's driving it falls on deaf ears. Some of the leading causes of mass migration that are underreported from Latin America include the war on drugs and U.S. trade policies.
I'd also like to welcome here the representatives from Mexico and Canada and tell them they are, in fact, welcome here. They are our partners in the future that we are trying to make together.
With Trump out of office, talk of the border wall construction has stopped for the time being. But does that mean the United States' stance on its drug policy and Mexico has changed? How has the war on leftist movements in Latin America created some of the most violent paramilitary drug cartels in recent history? Has the never-ending war on drugs and NAFTA helped fuel an influx of refugees from cartel atrocities and industry-destroying trade agreements? Can the austerity administration and hugs not bullets strategy of Mexico's current president, Manuel Lopez Obrador, be the answer to a country awash in corruption and violence? We'll ask these questions and more with host of Zero Books, Pop the Left, and Varn blog, C. Derrick Varn. This is Revolution.
And on Central America, President Reagan vetoed legislation which tied military aid to El Salvador to its human rights record. The bill, which passed Congress unanimously, extended the human rights certification process that had been in effect for the last 2 years. This issue of military aid to the El Salvador government is a major issue whenever it comes up, and there are indications it will be even more so next time, because Reagan administration officials, including Undersecretary of Defense Fred E. Clay and others on this program, have said recently that much more aid is needed. The reason they...
All right, without any further ado, I left out another show that he does. So he hosts his own show, Varn Vlog. He hosts Pop the Left, or co-host with Doug Lane. He also does Theorizing with a Hammer. We've been guests on his show, Varn Vlog. Now, this is his second time. First time with Dr. Robert.
Dr. Law Robert?
Doctor of kicking that ass. C. Derrick Varn.
Hi.
Varn.
Hey, what's up?
How you living?
I'm okay. Today was graduation day, and I'm a teacher, so I've been outside in 100-degree weather most of the day. So,
yeah, it's cold and can't breathe in hot ass Utah. I want to say real quick before we get too deep in the show, Varn is a high school teacher. My oldest son, you always see the little one that's 2. There's another one, a bigger one that is 17. He just graduated high school. Congratulations, Jason.
Oh, shout out to Jason Miles Jr.
Nah, it's Jason Dillon. He's not a junior. I made sure he got his own little fucked up identity.
Jason Dillon the first.
Jason Dillon the first. Yeah. So shout out. And then the oldest girl graduated from Laney College as well.
awesome.
That's what's up.
So it's been a busy week. But thank you to teachers like C. Derrick Varn.
Well, all right.
Awesome.
So I have some notes here. There's a lot of, I was talking to Pascal for the last 15, 20 minutes, and he was kind of poking fun at me because I did go down a rabbit hole of the cartels. And there was one thing that I did want to know, because I think this is part of the story, was when we talk drug cartels, generally we were always talking about the Colombian cartels. They're maybe the most famous due to the cocaine wars of the 80s. They give us things like Miami Vice, right? They give us where Pascal lives, Miami, as you know it. A lot of that real estate around there is purchased with the drug money from that drug trade. So do you want to get into at all how, with the capture and death and the capture of the Ochoa family, I think they turned themselves in, and the death of Pablo Escobar, we get the rise of the Zeta and Sinaloa and coastal cartels of Mexico.
Yeah. I mean, you get the rise of the Guadalajara cartel syndicate. And interestingly enough, your clip does hint at this. It's actually as much to do with NAFTA as it is with the end of the cocaine wars. What basically happens beginning in the mid to late 90s is it gets harder and harder for narco producers to get their product to the United States via illegal shipping, air, or port. Mm-hmm. And the opening up of trade routes with NAFTA makes Mexico prime grounds for transition. And you start seeing minor criminal syndicates becoming major players in getting the product to the United States. This originally kind of comes out of desperation. That's, it was a quick way for people to make money in the late 90s. But it gets maintained because there's just so much money in getting drugs from South and Central America into the U.S. and these cartels in the north of Mexico. Now, some of the more powerful cartels have moved further south in Mexico in the second half of the last decade. But these cartels in the north of Mexico were really able to come out as power brokers into getting the product into the United States. And the intensification, ironically, of both the war on terror and the American realization in the aughts that we were really losing the drug war. And maybe people just thought, well, if we're losing it, maybe if we just do it harder, we'll win. And so that actually started making this an even more lucrative situation for what were priorly fairly innocuous gangs. And where you're right is the power vacuum from the collapse of the biggest drug cartel in Colombia really shifted the focus into a bunch of seemingly minor players. Actually, they're not talked about a lot in the United States, and I would have a hard time telling you which one or two is the predominant ones in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. But it made the production there more and more important. Furthermore, after the cocaine wars and with the suppression of the FARC, and this is where U.S. foreign policy comes in again, the FARC started running more and more drugs into Central America, and because they had no other access to funds to maintain their guerrilla war with the Colombian government. And all those things came together to kind of like as a kind of perfect set of conditions for basically what I like to call like a lumpen bourgeoisie being established as middlemen in Mexico, because the drug trade in Mexico itself wasn't that lucrative. There wasn't nearly the demand there is in the United States.
So you're saying there wasn't the demand at the time
in Mexico itself. So no, yeah, there wasn't a demand at the time. There really isn't that much now. I mean, there was more and more actually as getting money in and out of the United States was harder, and runners from the cartel started paying in drugs and dumping those drugs back into Mexico. But when this started in the 90s, there was not that much demand in Mexico itself. The demand was getting stuff from Central and South America into the U.S. And with the collapse of the major 80s Colombian cartels, which had mostly gone through sea and air shipping, all those things began to fall apart. After 9/11, this gets even harder to get stuff in through this route. So this is where counterterrorism policy, one of two ways it comes in. The second way is grosser, and we'll get to that eventually.
You have a question, Pascal? You got that question looking here?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to get a kind of larger, kind of broader picture here of how exactly American foreign policy, particularly Cold War policy, before the fall of the Soviet Union, as an immigration policy and the contracting nature of capitalism, facilitate a development of a relationship with Mexico or other neighboring countries that makes this drug war not only fueling of mass incarceration to basically render the surplus labor to prison, which is we know is going to happen, but is there actually any kind of covert political way in which American intelligence and the deep state use these prerogatives to destabilize regimes that they found unfriendly? Can you talk about that somewhat, Varn?
Sure. I mean, one of the ways this was used was as a means of crushing a lot of left-wing insurgencies, which ended up turning to narco trading after, particularly once the Soviet Union became weaker and weaker, and they didn't really have support from China either to fund their own activities. But there's a lot more going on there. I mean, one of the things that you had was a suppression of agricultural labor in these areas. And so for a lot of, particularly actually indigenous and mestizo farmers, one of the only ways they could kind of get by and survive was, taking crops that were part of indigenous culture and getting them black market into the US. And since there was a demand for the drugs, it was there. This was able to, because of DA policy, this enabled the United States to use this as a pressure valve on a lot of these governments and to further legitimize support for, say, right-wing paramilitary groups and suppressing leftists, because they were also doing it under the guise of the beginnings of the war on drugs. The fact that this really ticks up in the 80s is not an accident. So particularly in Central America more than South America, it seems like this was really able to keep the regimes pretty weak. Another thing that this really leads to is the U.S. through both military and DEA policy starts to basically pick sides in local elites through picking sides in the drug wars. A friend of mine who was a kind of U.S. teacher in Honduras, went and said that they would constantly clear out, that the State Department and the military was actually constantly clearing out Americans so that they could intervene in the cartels there directly, often picking winners and losers in a way that that she felt destabilized the government. Now, it's hard to find research on this because it's covert as fuck. And I mean, the U.S. doesn't really totally admit that it's going on. But you'll just see a city, like a city in say Honduras, will have a bunch of military swarm in, and then one side of a cartel dispute will win. And it's hard not to draw conclusions that they're intervening directly.
Let's you said something that was very important, and I'd like us to revisit that. Mm-hmm. What you're saying is that in the period of the birth of neoliberalization, and for the audience, that basically means hyper privatization, destabilization of government functionality, and rendering state services to the market. There's also a correlation to how this affects not only domestic but regional agricultural policy in Mexico and Central South America. Yes. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, that change to hyper-privatization causes a destabilization in some Mexican and maybe Central American agricultural production. I would assume that destabilization means that they're required to import more American production, or maybe they're not even capable to do that. And what you're telling me is that once those those internal agricultural farms are destroyed in those Mexican and South American countries, Latin American, Central American countries, the peasant or working class is relegated to taking old cultural maybe cures like we have in the global South. Take this medication for this, or eat this herb, or this make you feel elevated and feel good, and turn that into literally a narcotics industry for survival purposes and ship that to the United States. Is that the phenomenon that we're talking about here?
Yes,
Correct
we are.
Well,
yeah, we are.
The Zapatistas, I have some notes here that I took from all the reading I did. They called NAFTA a death sentence when it started. And that's actually kind of where you get the Zetas come from, because they were a paramilitary group that were designed to actually crush the Zapatistas, which were small at the time. They were actually trying to push back against NAFTA because they knew what was going to happen. The quote is, the Zapatistas called NAFTA a death sentence, in part because the agreement would allow subsidized U.S. crops to enter the Mexican market, pushing small farmers off the land.
Is NAFTA the beginning of this process, or does it have an earlier precedent in the 50-year counter-revolution?
I think it really begins in the 60s and 70s, but NAFTA is where it accelerates for Mexico in specific. This process gets worse during the 70s and 80s, and it really seems to have the most effect in Central America during the kind of leftist uprisings in the 70s that mostly get squashed, or if they don't get squashed, they get forced to neoliberalize, which effectively ends up with roughly similar policies. You think of Nicaragua for an example here. You bring up the Zetas, and my interest in this is I lived in Torreon, Mexico for 2 years. I taught in a school in Torreon, and I taught there from 2013 to 2015. If you know anything about the cartel wars, that means that I was actually there at the end of the Sinaloa Zeta cartel war. The Zetas' history is, as you say, they were originally trained at what was then called the School of the Americas, and now is called the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation in Fort Benning, Georgia.
Before you go any further, put the School of the Americas in geopolitical context for our audience.
I read that they were trained at Fort Bragg.
Yeah, but where is it at? I think, well, it depends. There's a couple of different places they could have been trained at, but it doesn't. That is not as important as what they were actually doing. So what this was designed to do was prop up right-wing, a lot of junta activity in South and Central America. And it was done under maintaining U.S. trade policy in South and Central America, particularly large-scale agricultural interest, but also fighting terrorists such as and terrorist in quotation here, such as the FARC. During the late 90s, it started also shifting to counterinsurgency techniques and teaching counterinsurgency techniques that were being used in the Middle East as well. The founder of the Zetas was calling him paramilitary might not even be correct. I mean, they were formerly part of the Federalists, and they were basically part of the Mexican military, and they were a specific subgroup used to suppress largely indigenous movements in southern Mexico. But they also, as soon as the Zapatistas were kind of limited in scope in Chiapas, there's sort of a stalemate, and they still exist in Chiapas, and they kind of run their own autonomous zone. Weirdly, which you can tour as a Western tourist if you're willing to be. Yeah, if you're willing to go with a bag over your head to get there, so you can't betray them to the Federalists. It's kind of strange.
Yeah.
But what you got to do when you're holding on to a small chunk of territory and don't have a lot of funding. Anyway, so they pivoted them into fighting the cartels. And that was actually explicitly under cooperation with the U.S. government and under U.S. governmental directive starting in the late 90s. And they basically realized, if you can't beat them, join them. But we've also been studying all of this counterinsurgency and insurgency tactics. Why don't we use it? And so one of the things that made Las Zetas so disruptive is that most of the cartels operated on mob logic. So if you weren't really in their way, they pretty much left you alone. Las Zetas would do stuff like someone in your neighborhood like outed someone and drug or sex trafficking. You kill every male in the neighborhood and hang their body headless from a bridge. Like they were infamous for doing stuff like that, or going into a club and not just attacking the people in the club that outed you. You kill everyone in the club.
And these guys were trained with U.S. State Department or intelligence assistance at right-wing institutions created by the U.S. in the global South to be an educational vehicle to destabilize political and economic realities. Correct?
Totally. Yeah, totally. You're completely right about that. So they were there basically initially to there's a couple of things they were doing. One is suppressing left-wing insurgency. Two, and this is the backdoor genocidal element of it. They were basically involved in solidifying nation-building projects in these areas, which normally meant the clearing out of indigenous peoples, and by clearing out, I mean killing. So,
would you say that there's people also too in Central America? I can't speak for Mexico, but I know certain parts of Central America, indigenous people were known to be aiding leftist militia groups. So there definitely was a lot of destroying those communities as much as possible.
Yeah, there was a lot of aiding. There was also a lot of just blaming them and saying they were aiding and then going in and wiping them out on false pretenses. I mean, when you read about the stuff from the 80s, are like, I knew a lot of people who'd immigrated to Mexico from Guatemala and Honduras in northern Mexico at the time. And they would just say, my city's gone. The community I grew up with has been erased. Like,
they were finding all the bodies, right? Was it 2 years ago where they were finding all these bones, or 3 years ago in Guatemala in the hills, indigenous areas?
Well, when I was there in Mexico in 2015, they found both indigenous and student bodies. What was weird is there was, I think it was 15 students disappeared, and they started looking for mass graves. They found lots of different mass graves, not of the people they were looking for. And what that exposed was that the PRI in particular, but also various forces, various different political factions in Mexico have been working with the cartels to suppress these student groups and also indigenous people. Another example of that was as the cartel war started shifting from the border back into the port routes into Mexico. So a lot of the heat in Mexico now is no longer in the north where I lived, but in places like Michoacan, which is the western coastal region, also Acapulco. And what was going on there was almost a three-way civil war that was underreported in the West. I couldn't find good reporting on it when you and Pascal asked me for resources on it in English, even though it's kind of vaguely hinted at. The indigenous people started doing autodefensias, which are basically their own defense units, and disarming the cartels. And the federalists, who are supposedly fighting the cartels, went in and started disarming the autodefensias. And that's when the situation in Michoacan really escalated in terms of violence. So they were basically making sure that, for fear of another Zapatista kind of movement, that the indigenous communities in southern Mexico could not police themselves and were thus open to the drug trade, even though while simultaneously the Federalists were fighting the cartels, and that's in quotation marks.
Warren, for our audiences who are not familiar, can you explain what the Zapatistas are or were and what their politics were and what that phenomenon was about?
The Zapatistas was basically an indigenous quasi-anarchistic movement, which is about autonomous control of indigenous areas in southern Mexico. They really started expanding in the 80s, and they initiated an armed rebellion against the central government in 1994. The most visible, people kind of know in America, in the far left, about Subcomandante Marcos, who is probably no longer alive. That's not entirely known. And they were really inspirational for like indigenous autonomy in southern Mexico. So of course they needed to be really, really suppressed. One of the things that I think people need to understand about southern Mexico in particular is that indigenous groups make up a much larger part of the population than they do in northern Mexico and in central Mexico. So this was seen as a real threat to the central government. And the PRI really worked with the US, who was afraid of it, having agricultural effects, to make sure that this stayed very, very contained. So you can kind of think of it as roughly equivalent to maybe things in Bolivia. It's not entirely equivalent. They were more anarchist driven. That their inspiration is Zapata, who is a major like agrarian advocate in the Mexican Revolution, who was big on indigenous and mestizo land maintenance and land autonomy during the kind of settling out of the Mexican Revolution. Ironically, the Obrador family was a big part of this. They were suppressed then as well by the revolutionary government, actually.
What years are we talking about here?
So it is the original Zapata movement. It's in the 19 teens, 1920s. And then the reemergence or emergence as kind of an inspirational movement. You're in the early 1980s through 1990s. The rebellion is really cut off and limited to a small portion of Chiapas by the end of the 90s. And it has maintained itself as a kind of independent autonomous region that is more or less left alone by the Chiapas government. But it doesn't have the same power or reach that it did in the 90s in Mexico itself. However, you will see it used by other indigenous groups, like I said, in Michoacan, where the indigenous groups set up basically defense leagues to defend their communities, both indigenous and non-indigenous, against like the Templar cartel, which is a really violent cartel. And the Autodefensa leagues found themselves suppressed by the Federalists themselves. They were being suppressed by the central government.
Can I ask you a question, Varn? Because I want to get into the nuance here. Jason, I know you have a lot of questions as well. Do you have any examples of the U.S. explicitly using hardcore cartel drug dealers, supporting them, arming them, or paying them to neutralize political movements, activities, or ideologies or people that were in opposition to U.S. geostrategic purposes?
Hard examples are very hard to find. However, the cartels have tanks. I mean, you don't get Mexico in Mexico. A lot of the cartels have U.S. grade military hardware that they are able to either import in or steal from the Federalists, somewhat knowingly. Furthermore, there is a way in which there's a kind of dynamic really dangerous relationship between the way the U.S. interferes with these cartels and the way the central government in Mexico, particularly the pre 2006, would interfere with these cartels, and play each other and basically play various factions off of each other to maintain power. So in Mexico, you don't have outside of the Zapatistas rebellion, you don't have the same relationship to the population, to like right-wing paramilitary groups, because the PRI, which was the PRI is technically a member of the Socialist International, right? The PRI had been doing trade policy in favor of the U.S. as a way to maintain its own power base since the 70s. I mean, and definitely up through NAFTA. I mean, basically the destabilization of NAFTA finally caused the PRI to lose enough popular legitimacy that in Mexico they say they allowed, and I put this in quotations, the PAN, the Party of National Action, which was a right-wing party, headed by Vicente Fox, which in America, Vicente Fox is known as being the smiling, happy anti-Trump ad Mexican president, but he's really sort of equivalent to George W. Bush. He was a center-rightist, and the Calderon government, who succeeded him in really running the country. The PRI stepped out, and under U.S. pressure, the PAN increased emphasis on the drug war and really started using the Mexican military to, quote, fight the cartels, unquote. But given that a lot of these cartels, even if it was just through negligence, had U.S. grade military hardware, you can see where this led. It led to basically not even low key. I mean, there are times in which the northern states in Mexico were more dangerous than war zones. And
the murder capital of the world for a while.
Yeah, Juarez was. Torreon, where I lived, was the 7th most dangerous city in the world and the 3rd in Mexico, until 2014, I believe. And prior to 2006, Torreon was the safest city in Mexico. Now, one of the things that I think influenced the change in policy in relation to the cartels is it started destabilizing U.S. business. With NAFTA, a lot of U.S. production moved from Texas and the South into northern Mexico.
Now, this is very important right here, what you're talking about, these businesses that moved down into Mexico, because we're also talking about, and there was a movie that came out in the 2000s, I couldn't tell you the name of it, that it was a broad stroke over what was really going on, but there were also workers that were getting found in mass graves.
Yeah. They were suppressed. Like there was the use of suppressing strikes, but the cartel started kidnapping American businessmen, which led to the State Department finally removing like consular protection in a lot of the northern states of Mexico. Like when I was there, I had no consular representation, and what happened basically is a lot of the businesses that were in northern Mexico actually just from Querétaro, Guadalajara, the areas around Mexico City, and this really put northern Mexico in a bind. For a while, northern Mexico was one of the more prosperous regions of Mexico. It still is fairly prosperous. The Mexican economy, ironically, during this time period, the Mexican economy actually got a lot better. A lot of the mass migration that we saw at the border has not been of Mexicans. It's mostly been Central Americans who are, fighting their way through Mexico into the United States, ironically, to escape the cartels, which we have been playing off of them for 2-3 decades now. I mean, one of the things about
elaborate on that, please.
All these people that you're seeing coming from Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, they're mostly running from the pressures of declining agricultural results from climate change, because they're in the equatorial region and they're kind of boned, and worse and more effective, the cartels have decimated these areas with like murder rates that are hard to understand. I'll give you an example. The worst neighborhoods in the United States have a murder rate of about 12 per 100,000. During the high parts of the drug war, most, in the cartel wars in Mexico, you're dealing with war zone level death rates of about 30 to 40 per 100,000. In Honduras, the average murder rate in 2014, when I last checked it, was 85 to 110, depending on which stat you looked at, per 100,000.
Jesus.
Those are the people who are those are the people who are sending their kids to the border. They're not doing it to get drugs into the United States. That's what's perpetuated by obviously. But that was the first child crisis during the Obama administration, which people kind of forget. That's when this really started taking off. The border was actually when the murder rates hit what I'm saying in 2013, 2014. And people were just like, you know what? Get our kids out. We don't care. Just get them out. And they started sending them up. And, a lot of the attitude is get into the United States ideally. But if you can't get into the United States, even Mexico's better. Like, just get as far north as you can go. And that's directly related to cartel violence. And the U.S. interventions in these countries, it's a code word here, right, has not done anything to reduce that violence. Is anything, the more the U.S. has been involved, the more that violence has gone up.
Explain why. Can you explain why?
They've at least incentivized us, not if. At the very minimum, this is the least conspiratorial I can be. They've incentivized the militarization of local cartel and narco production groups there.
That's what I was trying to get to, Vaughn. The U.S. is incentivizing the militarization of the drug dealers.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, if they're not providing the arms directly, they're at least incentivizing them to do so. I mean, I tell people, American liberals always talk about gun control policy, and I have a very complicated stance on this. But one of the things I'll say is, like, Mexico has the same gun control policy as Australia. All right. It has more gun violence than the United States by a lot, actually. Why is that the case? Well, they're close to the U.S. for one thing, and we've used them as a way to dump a lot of guns outside of our own market into theirs. And their central government is either so weak or has no incentive to do much about it, despite the gun laws, that it actually has become the thing that bullshit conservatives say, whereas like law-abiding people in Mexico are unarmed and thus relatively unprotected. And when they do try to arm themselves, like the auto defensa, as I was mentioning in southern Mexico, the government uses those gun laws to go in and smash them. And that's the pretense, actually.
Can I add this? When Mexico likewise faced a major security crisis relating to drug cartels, it called on the United States to form a historic security cooperation agreement. The agreement, known as the Meridia Initiative, has seen about $3 billion in aid, assistance, and investment flow into Mexico since 2008. Crucially, the initiative endorsed the concept of shared responsibility, which captured the complex interdependence of U.S.-Mexican security. Under Meridia, the United States accepted its obligation to reduce the demand for illegal drugs and the flow of illegal weapons south of the border. Approximately 70% of the weapons seized in Mexico are smuggled in from the United States.
Right. They're not coming up from Guatemala. Like, they're coming down. And
go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. And well, the thing is, I don't even know the numbers for Central America. It's impossible to find, but I suspect that we'll find that most of those guns are American guns too. Some of them are probably like Cold War guns that were bought off during cheap AKs, basically after the fall of the Soviet Union. But a lot of them are going to be U.S. guns. But when I say like these cartels are armed, like they're not armed with just automatic weapons. When I was still in Mexico in 2015, right before I left to go to Egypt, 2015. Make sure I got my timeline right. One of the Guadalajara cartels took out RPGs on a Federalist helicopter. They had tanks. They had gone into federal armories in Mexico and just taken them over, and they'd taken U.S. weapons from those things, and they were using them to kind of police the area. When you encountered like armored vehicles in the North Mexican desert, you had to flip a coin on whether or not it was Federalists or cartels, and to the local population, frankly, it didn't make much difference.
Mm-hmm.
So, you would just see mass men who'd ask for your ID, and sometimes people would be taken off and they'd disappear. I mean, like, you would encounter this all throughout checkpoints in the North Mexican desert. I used to take buses through from Torreon into the United States when I would go and visit family, and the buses were armed, and even with that, you were constantly going through both narco and Federalist checkpoints, and they were like, you'd see like submachine guns stacked on the side of the road. You don't just get that, like, and the cartels could usually have more firepower than the Federalists did. Like, it's hard to explain. It really kind of boggles the American mind, because you don't think of the mob as having a tank. But in Mexico, effectively, the mob can have a tank, and the government is undeniably, both the U.S. and Mexican government is undeniably tied up into this. This is one of the reasons why there's been so many changes of parties in the past 15 years in Mexico. The PRI is roundly hated in Mexico and is very corrupt. But since the 2006 election, which is the fun, Obrador, the current president of Mexico, which kind of came in as a left populist coalition in 2018.
And liberals love him.
Yeah, they do. And he was probably fairly radical in 2006, actually. Someone has asked me, privately, do I think things would have been massively different under the Obrador 2006 regime? I don't think so. One, there's a popular belief in Mexico that the U.S. played a role in making sure that the election did not go his way when Vicente Fox defeated him.
Let me ask you this. And you were in Mexico, I think, at this time, and you lived there. I was just passing through for entirely too long. I got stuck. There allegedly, I shouldn't say allegedly, there is an email, but there has been some debunking of it. And emails leaked that actually talk about how the U.S. is going to back the Sinaloa cartel, who did not have the control of the market like the Zetas had at the time. The Zetas were just more, as we're saying, more violent, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is your take on that? Because that was when I first got there. This is like 2013, 2014. That was what people were telling me, that everything is better now, because that leak had came out saying that the U.S. is like, no, we're going to back the Sinaloas, who are just a little more business. Yeah.
So let's go into that a little bit. Everyone knows El Chapo in America. Like, he's famous as, unfortunately, the Stupid Left podcast has his name on it, right? Yeah. But El Chapo was a kind of a mafia figure. He was popular with a lot of people. When I lived in northern Mexico, he was liked is not the right word, but was seen as the way lesser of two evils.
He did some okay things to the community, right? Kind of like the stories we hear of drug dealers here. Like, here's some turkeys for your poor people.
So he would go in and like buy everyone in a community like a dinner. He would reinvest. He did reinvest in a lot of the communities in northern Mexico. His attitude towards building goodwill towards the Sinaloa cartel was like, if you basically show up and protect the people of the area, kinda, they'll at least turn a blind eye to what you're doing, even if it's super bloody. And he also did more or less instruct his people to minimize targeting of civilians. Not to say they didn't. I don't want to sound like I'm romanticizing him, but they weren't known for going into a city and beheading people and hanging them from a bridge. Let's just put it that way. However, basically it was seen as good business, and it was basically a kind of open conspiracy theory at the time when I lived in North Mexico, that the U.S. and the Mexican government were putting their finger on the Sinaloa side for stability reasons. So like, we're not going to try to get rid of the drug trade. We're just going to try to pick the side that isn't using our tactics and makes us look bad. And pick the side that operates like a more normal mob. What was surprising though, and what I worried about it when I lived in Mexico, is as soon as that was done, as soon as the Zetas were defeated, you started seeing all the stuff in the U.S. news about coming down on El Chapo. He was arrested.
Can you define the Zetas for those who don't know in the audience?
Yeah, the Zetas were a cartel that came out of a special forces group that we mentioned earlier, that were a subsection of the Federalists, first used to fight the Zapatistas, and then used to fight the cartels. They realized that they could make more money as a cartel, and actually broke up a kind of
pretty big, the coastal cartel, which was pretty big.
Yeah, they broke up the coastal cartel and threatened the Guadalajara cartel syndicate, basically, which Sinaloa, Sonora, Tijuana, and Juarez cartels were all part of. And there was a peace. When that peace was broken by the Zetas, that's when, and by U.S. intervention, basically, that was when things got super bloody in Mexico, right after the election in which Vicente Fox won, and the PRI kind of stepped out. And the PRI had no incentive to step in and try to do what they have normally done with the cartels. When Peña Nieto, who was the PRI president from 2012, he president. The transfer of power was when I was there from Calderon to Nieto, and they started doing a lot of their old stuff with the cartels. But by this point, it didn't work. They didn't have the power or the legitimacy to keep it down, particularly in the southern part of the country. But anyway, back to El Chapo. So in 2000, when the Zetas are finally defeated, because U.S. policy is basically taking a don't come down hard on the Sinaloa cartel, they encourage the Mexican government to arrest El Chapo. When they first arrest him, this is madness, and tells you how much the Mexican government had to be in on this. They put him in a very secure facility, supposedly in Mexico City. There's a 60-mile tunnel with lighting and electricity under that prison in which he escaped. Yeah. So, but the U.S. government eventually put enough pressure that he was extradited to the U.S. When he was caught a second time, and that was seen as a major betrayal by the cartels in Mexico, because it's like, well, we were playing ball with you guys, so we were supposed to play, and you came down and crushed our guy after supporting him. And the region that I was at, this was happening the last few years I was there. They were terrified because they were just afraid that the days of lead were coming back. It didn't there. It came back in the South. That was about the same time. El Chapo became kind of a media figure in the United States. And like I said, El Chapo Trap House, that podcast used to kind of offend me. Yep, they had a motorcycle in the tunnel too.
I never liked it. Well, I'll be quiet.
Yeah, but
if you want to indulge, we're 8 minutes away. But I'd like to, if you can indulge me, because I want to get. I think one of the things that I'd like to do on the show from now on, because someone asked us about this. I love your show, but I'd like to hear more solutions, political solutions. If you could argue, what should be a left politics that should be rooted in changing this reality for Mexican and South American people, and what should be an effective left politics on this war on drugs / immigration issue, if you could articulate one?
First would be harm reduction here actually matters, and I know that sounds silly and liberal, but it's actually a geopolitical issue. Destigmatizing and treating and reducing demand for the illicit drug trade, legalizing a lot of the lower scheduled drugs, marijuana.
Did Varn freeze?
Varn froze.
Oh shit!
Did the deep state get Varn when we started asking the real?
Oh shit! Varn.
Am I back?
Yeah.
All right. All right.
Okay.
So investment policy
and is one of them. Drug legalization across the board.
Across the board, or at least in everything that's not super deadly.
Low scheduled drugs. Low schedule.
Yeah, the low scheduled drugs. But there's other elements of it. Fair trade, like NAFTA, when we call it like a fair trade deal or an open trade deal, it is really a means of labor arbitrage. It furthers imperialism. If we have fair trade with surrounding nations, it actually needs to be fair and on equal footing. And it would actually probably be better for U.S. workers for it to be so. The unequal footing usually screws both labor and moderate scale and small business in the global South. Investment into indigenous community and more sustainable agriculture is going to be vital. Not incentivizing narco production through just crushing trade, driving down the commodities trade. I know that I can get really Marxist-y on here. This is hard to do because of the tendency of the rate of profit fall, but it's going to, any even reformist government and wanted to have anything like a responsible de-escalation of imperialism in Central America would have to do something to stabilize great agricultural prices, to allow for allow better access to local business to American markets. By local businesses, I mean local businesses in Central America to American markets, and not to incentivize American businesses going in and taking over the labor. And cross solidarity with labor in other countries, particularly in the Americas, because anytime you can play off the tension between the Americas and the United States, it leads to reactionary policy in both countries. And that's something that I've just seen over and over and over again. When you reach out across the board and build international solidarity between those groups, because both groups are hurt by these policies. Like U.S. labor is hurt by these policies, even if they're not hurt as bad as indigenous and local labor in the global South. I mean, it's not that I would not say that there's no gain to the developed worker, but there's not a lot, and there's a lot to lose. There's a lot more to be gained by having solidarity with these groups in other countries, and anything you can do to encourage that, to push for to allow for international unionizing and international that would be a huge thing for a left to do in the United States, and that would require legal labor reforms to allow for our labor unions can do it illegally, but legally it's currently not a legal thing. It's not a viable option in either country. So I don't know about Central America, but it's also not really viable in Mexico either. So it's these would be important things to change this. I mean, and a lot of them are actually doable. This is not like me saying we have to overthrow all of capital tomorrow to do anything about this, because while ultimately, yes, I think that in the immediate, no, we could do things right now. Another thing we have to do is to humanize our immigration policy and find ways to let as many of these people in until things settle down in their home countries. Because if they do settle down, a lot of these transfers of people to the United States there wouldn't be the same pressure. Now climate change and now filling in some of the gap. So even now if you were to reduce violence, there'd still be climate pressures, but having a humane policy for the integration of these people who are coming to the United States because of our policies. They weren't coming here, take our jobs or whatever. They're coming here because our economic and drug policies have made the countries that they've lived in living hells in some ways. And they were relatively peaceful areas before. And we've been doing that crap in Central America in particular for 100 years. Like at this point, it's, I don't like talking about justice because you can get all liberal, namby-pamby, teary-eyed, but it really is an issue of justice to just admit that, like, part of the reason why so many people want to come here is shit that we've done to their home countries. And it's, and we should accommodate that as best we can.
Don't you think the first step of a left politics in this area is giving the American public the political education about the fact that how immigration from Central America into Mexico to the United States is a product of a bipartisan consensus of destabilization in the global South in those regions?
Yeah, I mean, there is a truth to that meme, right? Where like you just paint some smiley faces as and some rainbow colors on the drones. I mean, there is a real truth to that in Latin America. There's been very little change in policy, regardless. I mean, the Obama administration changed the tone of a lot of these policies in the Americas and pivoted to Asia, which is a whole nother thing entirely. I'm sure you'll have guests on, but didn't really change the policies at all. I mean, and they basically devolved it to like state legislatures to figure out a way to tax weed as a kind of an answer. And anytime a state does that, yes, it weakens the cartels. Yes, it actually helps with violence, but like it's such a tiny drop in the bucket of this global policy chain. And it's, it was started, this project really was started under Reagan, was formalized under Bill Clinton, and was maintained under and intensified under the war on terror during the Bush administration, and was not undone by the Obama administration, and was not undone by the Trump administration, despite any, anti-imperialist wankery he kind of tried to sometimes claim to. It's been consistent regardless of who's in power in the United States. It is very much bipartisan, and the only real difference in the partisanship is the tone on which they put on it and how naked they are about it.
Does that answer your question, Pascal?
Very good.
Varn, are you coming with us for the bonus half?
Yeah, I can.
All right. We're going to have another special guest with us in the bonus half as well. So if you guys have done it already, then I'll see you shortly. If you have not, become a patron. It's easy. It's cheap. And as you can see, Pascal looks so much better right now. It's because we've been able to get him lighting now. Upgrades like this board.
I don't know if Pascal's happy about the board.
The board is a beautiful thing. The board is a beautiful thing. Don't ever talk shit about the board. You play music from the board. You can talk shit from the board. Love it. And when we go live, we do a whole show from the board. That being said, his name is Derrick Varn. You can catch him. He has a video out right now on Zero Books. He has a series called Theorizing with the Hammer. He has a show with Doug Lane called Pop the Left. He also has his own show that Pascal and I were on. There's links in the description wherever you're watching to this show or listening to this show once it goes on audio podcast.
Vaughn, thanks for coming on, man. Enjoyed the conversation. A lot of weed to get into here.
We still aren't done with the conversation. We have to get deeper with this conversation in the other half. Because there's a whole aspect of the current president in Mexico right now, AMLO, that we didn't get a chance to get into because we had to get into the whole cartel shit. I honestly didn't know we were going to talk cartel shit for like 25, 30 minutes. And we could have went longer on the cartel. I could have.
But cartels and U.S. trade policy are so intimately related, it's not even funny. And military policy is directly related too. And I've been studying this now informally for like 10 years since I lived in Mexico. And I feel like I'm barely scratching the surface. And I'm always discovering stuff that's shocking. Just shocking.
So I won't take a lot of time because we're already over an hour. My first time in Juarez, Mexico, as we got driven in, we park our car, and we're unloading our gear, and we're kind of walking around a city that looks nothing like El Paso, right? It's right next to El Paso. It's kind of a rundown city, and the buildings, I would say maybe 2-3 stories up, are just missing posters for women. And when we first went there, like I said, 2013, 2014, they were finding some mass graves. It's a deep story. We're just scratching the surface. We're going to get into it more on the other side. Before we go, I do want to play a clip from a good friend of mine, high school friend that came on the show. She is an attorney for deportation cases, and she had a client who I think this is his third time. He's going to be going to trial. They threw the first 2 out. He won his asylum case not once, twice. Now he's got to go for a third time. If he goes back to El Salvador, that's why he won his case, he most likely will be killed. So I'm going to play this clip, and we're going to go out on that clip.
Not only in the states most heavily affected, but in every place in this country are rightly disturbed by the large numbers of illegal aliens entering our country. The jobs they hold might otherwise be held by citizens or legal immigrants. The public service they use impose burdens on our taxpayers. That's why our administration has moved aggressively to secure our borders more, by hiring a record number of new border guards, by deporting twice as many criminal aliens as ever before, by cracking down on illegal hiring, by barring welfare benefits to illegal aliens. In the budget I will present to you, we will try to do more to speed the deportation of illegal aliens who are arrested for crimes, to better identify illegal aliens in the workplace as recommended by the commission headed by former Congresswoman Barbara Jordan. We are a nation of immigrants, but we are also a nation of laws. It is wrong and ultimately self-defeating for a nation of immigrants to permit the kind of abuse of our immigration laws we have seen in recent years, and we must do more to stop it.
She's a defense attorney for deportation cases, and she has a very, very special, I shouldn't say special case, a case that I want you guys to share as much as possible, because I think it's important to get as much information out about this case, because it really kind of shows how horrible the immigration policies in this country are, and it's a bipartisan issue. Raha Georgiani.
Hello. Hi, it's such a pleasure to be with you both. Thank you so much for having me, and good to see you.
Good to see you. Hey. Thank you for taking some time to talk to me today. I know you're really, really busy because you're doing a big press push for your case, right?
That's right. I appreciate you both taking the time to have me on and helping raise awareness about the case of Walter Cruz. Insane facts.
So I'll try to be brief. I know you don't have a lot of time. You have a client, Walter Cruz. He gets picked up. He's been here for what, 20 plus years?
Yeah, he's been here since 2004, so going on 20 years. And
Walter gets picked up, and he wins his asylum case. I should probably add, when he was a young man, he tattooed by a government informant, a gang tattoo. So he's can't go back to his home country of El Salvador, which he doesn't even really know anymore, right? And he wins his asylum case, and then what happens?
So, sometimes I say the facts of Walter's case out loud, and I almost sort of can't even believe that we are where we are. But essentially, Walter presented his case to an immigration judge back in 2018. He did all the things he was supposed to do. He brought evidence and experts, country conditions, human rights reports, everything. And the judge said, yeah, you should be protected under U.S. laws. You have shown that you're more likely than not to be tortured if you return to El Salvador. And then the government appealed. The thing about the government appealing is that when an immigrant is detained and even if that immigrant wins their case and the government appeals, oddly enough, the immigrant stays in custody while the Department of Homeland Security appeals. So the case was appealed, and the appellate body, the Board of Immigration Appeals, sent the case back on a technicality and said, you gotta do this part again and fix this. So we did, and Walter won again. Once again,
so an immigrant. Two times. And usually when you win your case, you get released. But no. He won his second case during